Despite the fact that they've been out of the metagame for about a year now, most people still don't like kaijus. A lot of people have a lot of complaints about the kaiju archetype, mainly that they don't like their monsters being removed for free. Now, kaiju monsters, for all they're worth, are not completely free. You do take a -1 because you are getting them out of your hand to remove an opponent's monster, and on that video that I made a while ago, one of my earlier big videos on this channel was how kaijus changed Yu-Gi-Oh! And there are literally hundreds of comments from people that say that they hate getting kaiju, they wish kaijus never existed. So it's really weird to be in a spot where kaijus aren't seeing a lot of play anymore. Whether or not that's because there aren't enough cards that you want to kaiju, or whether or not people are just playing hand traps instead. But realistically, outside of Burning Abyss and a few other side decks, kaijus are not seeing that much play at a competitive level anymore. Maybe people are playing them at their local levels or against friends, but overall, when you go to a tournament, the chances of you getting kaiju'd in 2019 are pretty low. All things considered though, even if kaijus aren't seeing a ton of play, that's not to say that kaijus will never see play ever again. Pretty much since their inception back in 2015, they have seen play in some side decks somewhere, and that really hasn't changed too much. You still do see it every once in a while. They're just not the competitive mainstay that we got used to for like 3 years, where every single player was playing kaijus, and that definitely hurt the success of many rogue strategies out there. But these days, you don't really have to worry about kaijus as much. Most people are just playing hand traps, and if they're playing a kaiju-like card, they're probably playing raw sphere mode instead. There are a few ways that you can play around kaijus. I mentioned this in that How Kaijus Changed Yu-Gi-Oh! Video, but the best way is to simply not play decks that lose to single monster removal. These sort of protect the castle decks that we used to know a lot really aren't that popular in 2018 or 2019, and the one that is popular right now has a card that prevents your opponent from summoning at all, which means that it doesn't really matter because it can't get kaiju'd in the first place. But let's say you don't want to switch decks. Let's say you still really want to play decks like Super Quantums or Raid Raptors, and you're sick of your opponents hitting you with a kaiju monster and ruining your big boss monster. Well, good news, friends, because Konami has released a new secret rare in Savage Strike, which comes out this weekend at the sneak peek, and this is a direct counter to all of the kaiju monsters that your opponent could be playing, and it is perhaps one of the funniest direct counters that I've ever seen Konami make, and that is Super Anti-Kaiju War Machine Mecha Thunder King. Yes, that is all its actual name. This is a new world premiere card. It is a TCG exclusive. We've never seen it before, and in today's video, I want to analyze this card for all it's worth, talk about whether or not it's a decent counter to kaiju, spoiler alert, it is, and also talk about whether or not this card has competitive potential. So first things first, this is a level 9 machine light monster with 2200 attack and 2100 defense. You're not necessarily playing this card for its stats, as with most of the kaijus out there. You don't really care about too much of that stuff, but it's just worth mentioning in case you happen to have a synergy with any of this card's attributes. So this card's effect says during the main phase, so not your main phase, not your opponent's main phase, either main phase, as a quick effect, you can discard this card, banish one kaiju monster you control that is owned by your opponent, then you can special summon one monster from your graveyard. You can only control one kaiju monster, which is the same thing that all the kaijus have, and then it says this card is unaffected by other kaiju cards' effects. Also, it cannot be destroyed by battle with a kaiju monster, and also during your end phase, not your opponent's end phase, if this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon this card. You can only use this effect of Super Anti-Kaiju War Machine Mecha Thunder King once per duel. Admittedly, that is a lot to unpack on one card effect, and if you've never seen this card before, it's especially difficult for you because there's so many different things happening, but the main idea of this card is that when you have it in your hand and your opponent kaiju's one of your monsters, you can discard this card to banish the kaiju off the field and then special summon what they just kaiju'd. That is the surface level analysis of this card, and on paper that is a pretty funny way to hard counter your opponent's kaiju monster. They're using the kaiju as a -1 to remove whatever boss monster you have already, and then this thing just brings it right back. But what's especially cool about that effect that I've seen a lot of people miss is that this does not actually have to special summon the monster that your opponent tributed. You can special summon anything in your graveyard, and that is very strong, and a lot of people missed it, so I wanted to call attention to that in today's video, because special summoning any monster from your graveyard is really good. It's especially good when it's on your opponent's turn, and it's something that a lot of people miss when they read this card, because on paper this thing is just meant to revive the card they just tributed, but it has so many other uses, especially as the game goes on. If you are playing a matchup where there are multiple Kaiju monsters in your opponent's deck, you can repeatedly use copies of this card over and over again to repeatedly get monster born effects, and not necessarily on what your opponent is Kaijuing. This is really useful because if you have multiple strong monsters in your graveyard, your opponent is very weary then of Kaijuing your cards anymore, because you could revive any of the other cards in your grave. Already this card looks pretty good if your opponent has a Kaiju monster and you're trying to protect one of your boss monsters, because you're taking a 1-for-1 trade, yes, but you are also protecting the boss monster in the process, or at the very least reviving something else in your graveyard. The really cool thing about this card is that it brings itself back during your end phase, and yes, that is a little bit of delay, so you're not going to get this immediately, but when it comes out, it's pretty tough for your opponent to deal with if they sided in Kaijus against whatever you're playing. Because this card is unaffected by other Kaiju cards' effects, it means that your opponent can't use Interrupted Kaiju Slumber to deal with this thing. It also can't be destroyed by battle with Kaiju monsters, which is really cool because the most common Kaiju monster is Gamma Seal, and if your opponent has one of those on their board, you can simply crash with it and your opponent's monster is destroyed and yours isn't. But probably most importantly, just by having a Kaiju monster on your board, your opponent can't attempt to Kaiju you anymore, because Kaijus can only be controlled one on each side of the field, as this card says and all the other Kaijus say. So if you have a Kaiju monster on your board already, your opponent can't attempt to tribute one of your other cards for that Kaiju. This came up a few times in dinosaur decks because you could tutor out the Dogoron Kaiju from your deck sometimes, but this is especially cool because this is a more generic card that you can just special summon for free as long as you trigger its first effect. And I guess even to go a step further, you don't actually need to trigger its first effect to special summon this from the grave. If you happen to be playing a deck like Burning Abyss and you milled this card off of Dante, you could potentially bring this back during your end phase and prevent your Beatrice from being tributed, which I actually think is a pretty unique application of this card. However, one question still remains after analyzing this card so far, and that's, will this card see competitive play? Sadly, I believe that the answer now is no, and the answer for the future is also no, but for different reasons. This card won't see play when it's released in Savage Strike, at least not for the first couple months, because not many people are actually playing Kaiju monsters. I already talked about this at the beginning of the video, but the only deck that's really playing Kaiju monsters right now consistently across most of the builds is Burning Abyss. But when was the last time that you played a Burning Abyss player at a regional or a YCS level? There certainly are Burning Abyss players out there. They are still topping events, but they're not topping enough and they're not consistently main decking Kaijus enough for you to actually consider putting this card in your side deck. There are many other choices that you could play against Burning Abyss that would also have applications in other matchups. Things like Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries to hit the Dante would probably be a better side deck than the good old super anti-Kaiju War Machine Mecha Thunder King. But then your question might be, but Doug, what if Kaijus suddenly become relevant again? What if everyone is side decking Kaijus, or a lot of people are siding Kaijus? Will this card see play in the future if that happens? And unfortunately, the answer is still no. And the biggest reason is that this thing is a hard counter to a card that your opponent might not draw and might not even be side decking. Even when Kaijus were at their most popular, it's not like your opponent was side decking them every single game. Sometimes they just didn't have room for them. Sometimes they went first. Sometimes they just didn't think that they were good in the matchup. Unless you were playing a deck that you knew your opponent would be side decking Kaijus against every single game, and also you knew that every opponent you were playing was using Kaijus, and also that you knew your opponent would open that Kaiju and you would open this card in your hand, unless all four of those things, that most of them you can't actually control, unless all of those things happen at the exact same time every single time at a tournament that you play this card is not looking so good. And that's a real shame because it is hilarious and I really would like to see this actually happen at a tournament. I'm sure someone somewhere will actually resolve this card and it'll be amazing. I hope that happens in a feature match or a live stream, but overall these specific counter cards like this one just don't end up seeing too much competitive play, even when the cards that they're countering are very, very popular. When you're looking at cards like this, you'd rather have a card that is a specific counter but also has other applications. I think back to something like Starlight Road, which was a specific counter for Heavy Storm. However, because Starlight Road did not specifically name Heavy Storm in its text, you could use it against a variety of other situations. You could use it against Black Rose Dragon, you could use it against Torrential Tribute, and because this card only works against Kaiju monsters when your opponent Kaijus you, it makes it a little bit too specific. This card needs to be a little bit more generic. Of course, if they made it more generic, I'm not entirely sure how to do that, and it would actually kind of ruin the lore of this card. I like this card from a design standpoint. I just don't believe that it'll be competitive enough to see play at the top tables or in anyone's main or side deck. However, just let me end this video by saying one last thing, and that's that you are completely open to play this card in whatever deck you want to. If you truly hate kaiju monsters and you feel that the world has it out for you and everyone constantly kaijus you, then by all means play this card, because when it resolves that one or those 2 times, it'll be hilarious. You will have so much fun. The look on your opponent's face will be worth playing it in your side deck all those tournaments. Will you top those events? Probably not, because you have a mostly blank card in your side deck for the entire event, but the one time that it goes off will be amazing. I can promise you that. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.